We've all been rejected at a particular point in our lives, right? For me, I've told you about my social awkwardness before. If I don't appear socially awkward to you, it's only because I've practiced, right? Before I approached you, I practiced in my brain what I was going to say to you, and I've been around human beings for a little bit now, so I've been able to practice like socializing. As a teacher for 7 years, that was kind of important skill to learn. But I have been and was very socially awkward, and so because of this, I experienced rejection quite a bit. But none stung like the rejection of of Julie before she was my wife. Now, we started dating, and if you were here at the marriage roundtable last week that we had on Sunday night, you heard the story of when I took my wife out to dinner. It was our first date, our first real date to Outback, and I tried to write a check at Outback because where I'm from, that's cool. Like, there's no like chain restaurants or anything. There's 2 restaurants in the county. And so when I came here and like to the big city of like Barbersville and Scott Depot and Hurricane, where you all have like chain restaurants, we took her to Outback, and at the end of it, I wrote a check, thinking this would be cool. And I wrote a check for $40-something. I handed it to the waiter, and you could see the waiter's face, and Julie's face too, which was a little like, what on earth are you doing, handing the waiter a check? And the waiter was really nice. He came and got me later, and he pulled me aside, and he said, hey, we don't take checks. And so I had to go tell this girl that I really liked that I needed her to pay for our first date. Now, besides that, my wife, I usually tell her like what I'm going to talk about, just like to make sure that I'm not going to embarrass her or myself too much, because I'm socially awkward. I don't know what's cool to tell and not to tell. So I asked her. She's like, "Don't tell these things. Like these things about you, no one should know these things but me, right?" So one thing on this first date, when we're sitting there and she's paying for my dinner, is I can't wear jewelry. I can't. I don't like it. I can't wear it. Not for any physical issues. I don't get rashes or anything. It's just like I just don't like stuff on me. And so I can't wear jewelry. And so we were there, and I don't have watches on. I didn't have a cell phone or anything like that. People had cell phones. I just didn't have one. I didn't see the need of one. There's pay phones all over the place at the time. You could stop and use one of those. So I as we're sitting down to eat, because I don't have a cell phone and I don't wear watches, I have a clock, which seems completely rational to me. So I take this clock, that's probably about this big, and I set it on the table, and she looks at me like, why do you have a clock? Are you in a rush to go somewhere? And I'm like, I just want to know what time it is. And it's a little awkward to ask people what time it is, so I carry a clock with me. Now, there's things called pocket watches that I apparently had not heard of that you could hide away, but I had a clock that I sat on the table. Needless to say, the date didn't go well. She was laughing, but I don't know if it was with me or at me. But I experienced rejection after that, right? It wasn't my finest evening. Now I recovered, but it stung, right? Being rejected, but there was that joy of being brought back into that relationship after I got rid of the clock and moved to a debit card system that was super sweet. So. What we're going to look at, as we look at Romans, is we're going to see Paul in chapter 11 discussing whether or not the people of Israel are rejected. Because I want you to take in mind what we've read so far. It's really hard to take pieces of Scripture out of context or to isolate them by themselves, remembering this is a letter. And so think about what we've discussed up until this point. Right? Paul has told the Church of Rome that the Gentiles are in the fold, that the law doesn't save. He's talked about God's sovereign election. And now what he's going to be talking about is Israel, it's not that you have been rejected at a whole. And so you can imagine the Jews who are reading this probably feel rejected as a people and as a nation. And the Gentiles who've been accepted, you can see the pride that might develop there. Thinking, man, you were rejected, but we were accepted. There must be something about us. So Paul is going to be dealing with these things. And so if you're a note taker, we have 4 points. The remnant of ethnic Israel, the hardening of ethnic Israel, the hope for ethnic Israel, and grafting in of true Israel. Let's go ahead and pray before we begin. God, we thank you for your grace and your mercy. You are worthy of praise. Lord, I pray that when we come here today, this is not about what we get and it's not about us. Lord, that this is a worship service and that we worship you. That as we hear your word, as we sing your song, God, that our heart is just grateful and in awe of what you have done, and that we have a mind and our heart is rejoicing. God, we thank you and we praise you for drawing us together so that we can worship you and Lord, just observe your word and hear it. And Lord, I pray that all distractions will be put aside. Any technical difficulties we might have, you put aside, and that we can really just focus on what your word says. Lord, give me clarity of thought, and help me not be a distraction. Let me point to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you would, turn to Romans 11:1 as we read. It reads, I ask them, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul feels the need, right, to defend God's treatment of Israel. And Paul points to himself, right? God has not given up on the people of Israel, right? He says, listen, I am an Israelite. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. God has not obviously given up because he's redeemed me. So Paul was a display of this remnant of Israel. And today, right, the majority of the nation of Israel does not believe. There are more Jewish Christians than we may think. There's about 300,000 professing Jewish Christians. There's different views from Jews. The Orthodox view was probably a smaller position at this point. They believe there is a literal coming Messiah, but that he is a man, that he is not God. That he is a man who's coming as a ruler. And if you read the New Testament, you can see that's a trend. That's something that the apostles thought and the disciples thought that the Messiah would be, this ruling figure to displace Rome out of Jerusalem and out of Israel. And so they're looking for a man as a Messiah. A friend that I have, a rabbi in Charleston, he explained to me the Reformed conservative position. And there's different subcategories of these, but another thought is the nation is the Messiah. The nation itself is this promised refuge for Jews, and that Israel, the nation, will be a blessing to the world. And then you have many ethnic Jews who deny the Messiah altogether. Right? They're secular Jews. But I want you to listen to Paul's defense on whether God has rejected national Israel. Romans 11:2-3 says, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel. Verse 3, Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. Now, Paul is referencing the time after Elijah's defeat of the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. Now, if you don't know this story, King Ahab, right, he had, I think it was like 850 prophets of Baal. He brings them up, and he says, okay, I want you to burn this offering, and there's this competition between the 850 prophets of Baal and and Elijah. Well, Elijah wins. God answers his prayer, and he mocks and makes fun of these 850 prophets of Baal. It's really interesting. If you want to go read it, it's 1 Kings 18 and 19. It's really kind of a funny chapter, 18 is, because he's mocking them and making fun of them. And that's always fun. So what we see is that Elijah, after this, has these prophets killed. All 850 of them. For leading Israel astray. Ahab runs to his wife, Jezebel, and she orders for Elijah to be killed. And so Elijah begins to run away. He begins to flee the chariots that are pursuing after him. He runs for 18 miles. 18 miles. And in a moment of exhaustion, he literally tells God, I alone am left. Right? And what we see, right, we see a people who've turned to this idol, this false god, and over again. This isn't just the first experience. We see a people who've rejected God, not a God who's rejected his people. But you can see this through the entire Old Testament, and you see it again in the New Testament. This is the people of Israel rejecting God is not a New Testament phenomenon. It's a cycle, a continual rejection by many. And I know when I read this, I often think, like, Israel, how can you keep rejecting God? You see all these things that he's done for you in generations past, but you keep rejecting him over and over and over again. How can you do that? But then I got to look in the mirror, right? And see the continual rejection. I have the same scriptures they have. I've seen God do some amazing and incredible things, and I think to myself, how do I keep rejecting God over and over again, his will and his statutes and his law? But what this speaks to is the depravity of man. It speaks to the depravity of man. We can see that sight is not enough to bring about faith. Right? These people saw God working, and it was not enough to bring about faith. The eyes of the lost stay closed to the things of God because they are dead. They do not see God at hand. It is only the Holy Spirit who can open the eyes of the faithless. It is the Holy Spirit who can illuminate the darkness and give perseverance to his saints. But I want you to listen to Elijah's words. Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left. And they seek after my life. I've talked to a lot of people who feel this way at times. They feel that they are deeply alone. And typically it's not because someone's pursuing after them or they've seen a group, their church, all start burning children on the statue of Baal. But typically it's because they've isolated themselves from some sort of biblical community. And now they feel alone. But Elijah's, man, when you really think about what he's going through, that his people have rejected God, and now he alone is left. But watch God's reply. Watch his response. He says, but what is God's reply to him? This is verse 4 in Romans. I've kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. God reminded Elijah that you are not alone. There's still a remnant of 7,000 strong. Now I want to remind you of who Baal was. Right? He's this idol. He's this false god of the Phoenicians, of the Canaanites. As I mentioned a second ago, they would often put their newborn babies on these hot iron hands of Baal, and they would kill their newborns. Baal was known as a god who, there's a lot of poetry about him. The exalting of him raping his sister, raping his daughter, and also raping his mother in order to humiliate her. That's the idol and god that Israel has begun to worship. You can see why Elijah maybe felt alone. But what we see, and it's interesting that Paul is looking back at Elijah, at people who've denied God then, and he's saying, listen, they are denying it now. And there's a moment where Paul feels deeply alone as he sees his countrymen deny the Messiah. Many of them try to kill him, and he has to flee over and over again. You can see why Paul is maybe feeling this in those who are in Rome, the Jews who are in Rome, in the church, why they may feel this way as well. But what we see is something interesting, that God will not lose. Right? He is victorious. Death could not hold him down, and neither will our disobedience. And so Paul draws on this past to give hope to the present time. Romans 5, verse 6, he says, so too at the present time there is a remnant, chosen by grace, but it is by grace. It is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What we see and what we've seen in the past chapters, right, is that ethnic Israel was very confused on the purpose of the law. Right? They had this misdirect focus on that salvation was somehow works-based. And what we see Paul, he tells them that the remnant is chosen by grace and saved by grace. Something else we see is that unbelief is a natural act of man. Right? Unbelief is a natural act of man, and for those who believe, know your faith is a supernatural act from God. So what we see is this remnant exists by grace. Look, work to earn grace nullifies it. Work to appreciate grace certifies it. I want to say it again. Work to earn grace nullifies it. Work to appreciate grace certifies it. If someone gives you a gift, and it is a gift, they don't send an invoice with it, right? That'd be a crappy gift. But when our works testify to our unearned favor from God, our works certify that we are truly saved, that we are His. But when we work to earn favor, we bring reproach upon God's mission. And what are we saying when we try to work for salvation? Or we're saying that God's grace is not enough, that we need to add something, that it's God plus something. And this is exactly what the majority of Israel did. So we see that there's a remnant who God has called to Himself, who existed out of an overflow of His grace and of His mercy. So the majority of Israel was hardened by what we call common grace. And I'm going to go to my next point, the hardening of ethnic Israel. If you would, look at 11, verses 7 through 10. It says, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. Right? God did not randomly harden the hearts of the majority of his chosen people. Right? The hardening of Israel happened due to their stubbornness and their sin, this continual rejection. To reiterate from weeks prior, if you're not a Christian right now, it's not because you're not chosen by God, it's because you're a disobedient sinner who's rejected Christ. Matthew 13, 12 through 16, and this is a few verses, but listen to this. It says, for to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables. Because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, a prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and with their eyes they have been closed. At least they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. God invites all to be reconciled to Himself, but continual rejection results in the hardening of the heart. So what we see is the rejectors of God have their eyes blinded and their ears deafened to the gospel call. But see, our mission is to not give up on anybody. Right? Our mission is not to give up on anyone. We don't know who the remnant is. The mission of God is to do good works in front of the spiritually blind. Right? We are to do good works in front of the spiritually blind and to scream hope to the spiritually deaf. That is our mission. So let me reiterate. What brings hope is the truth of the gospel. It is what needs to be preached here and beyond by you and your homes and your workplaces and your communities. Right? Not harmful hints to life, not a religious message of comfort, but the gospel. And it is the only object of hope. It's the only thing that we can give that can allow someone to cling to any hope of salvation, to any hope of life eternal. The next verses, 11 through 14, my next point is hope for ethnic Israel. It reads, "So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them." Paul writes of God's plan of saving others to stir up this holy jealousy in Israel. Right? The heart of jealousy is to say, I want what they have. You see value in what they have, and you want it. You wish you can obtain it. I remember when, as an unbeliever, now my dad, when he got remarried to his current wife, they were, I saw them at the time, they were church people. Right? We weren't really in church. We went to church every so often at Episcopal church. That says, I'm not saying anything about that denomination, but that particular church was dead. I never remember the gospel being preached. The reverend got up every week and talked about Forrest Gump. That's not a joke. Like, I'm being dead serious. I don't know if he was telling parables or what, but he talked about Forrest Gump almost every time we ever went. Maybe it was just happenstance. I don't know. But that we went very sporadic at best. And so when my dad married these church people, I was highly skeptical. And we moved in with them, and it was interesting. God had placed me, this lost person, with my sisters, who I'm deeply close with, which is funny. Like, there's a sense I'm much closer to them than I am my brother because we share a faith. And so it was incredible. They were about a year older than I am. They were in college at the time, and here I am, very skeptical of faith. But what I saw when I was with them, when I was living with them, was genuine faith, a genuine care. It's not that their life was perfect. It's not that they didn't get arguments. It's not that everything was. I lived with them. I saw all the grit and grime, but I saw genuine faith. And I remember saying to them, I wish I had what you had. They were trying to share the gospel with me. And I can remember exactly where I was, and I was getting frustrated because I said, I wish I had what you have, but I don't. I didn't need to see perfection. I saw joy. I saw genuineness. And it made me jealous because I was miserable. It made me jealous. I wanted this hope. Whatever it was that set them apart, I wanted it. Do we live and share in such a way to stir jealousy in non-believers around us? Right? Do people see joy in you, or do they see you as a miserable human being? Not just in your mental state, but are you hard to be around because of your negativity? Let me encourage you. Think about this. If God turns to the Gentiles, which is us, to stir up a holy jealousy in the Jews, then your life ought to cause, a holy jealousy for non-believers who see you. And say, I wish I had what you have. Romans 11:15 and 16 says, for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Verse 16 says, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. Now, I want to break this down a little bit, 15 and 16, because you have different metaphors happening here. And if you read this, you're looking at, you're talking about lumps of dough and roots and branches, and you might read this and go, I have no clue what this dude is talking about. What does lumps of dough and roots and branches have to do with one another? So I want to look at verse 15 first to kind of break it down. It says, again, for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So what Paul is telling the church of Rome is this. Despite Israel's rejection of the Messiah, God brings about reconciliation. Right? God's rejection of unbelieving Israel is temporary. And some would be accepted through faith and receive a new life. So it is not as if God has rejected all Jews. Is exactly what we saw in 11 verse 1. Right? Paul says, obviously he hasn't. I'm here. So Paul's saying it's not that he's done with Israel. Verse 16 says, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Again, I want to break this down a little bit. In the Old Testament times, the priest could offer an offering to the Lord from a lump of dough. So it would pinch off some of a lump of dough. And if this first fruit was holy enough to be offered to the Lord, the rest was suitable to prepare and eat. So the metaphor is illustrating God's gracious election of Israel. If you have the first fruits, so when it says first fruits, this is dealing with Abraham, right, who by faith was justified, believed in a promise. This first fruit, Abraham was consecrated. He consecrated the whole. So the branches, which represents the descendants of Abraham, right, they grow from this root. So by God's gracious election, his people leads to the inclusion of others. Right? So through Abraham, God setting him apart, his descendants get the benefit. And here's the other thing, the inclusion of others, that includes us as Gentiles, right? Because what we read a couple weeks ago is that true Israel are those of faith, those who share a faith with Abraham. So that inclusion now has been extended to the Gentiles, to us. And so this is where Paul goes with the grafting of true Israel. Verses 17 through 20 says, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, altogether a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith, so do not become proud, but fear. So what we see, right, is these branches broken off. This is unbelieving Israel. You, as a Gentile, were a wild olive shoot, and you were grafted in. You were adopted into this family. And it says you share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. What it's saying is that you share in the promises that were given to Abraham. Now the promise is given to you because you've been adopted into that family. So New Heights, you are primarily a Gentile church, like the church at Rome. And you've been grafted into God's promises. So Paul is using this metaphor again. The tree and the branches and the root. So to bring energy to the tree, to this olive tree, oftentimes in the ancient world, they would graft branches from wild olive trees to help them grow for years and even centuries. They would bring health and energy to the tree. So Gentile, you are the wild olive shoot that's been grafted in. I want to read this part again. It says, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Again, you're part of this family. adopted and received the benefits, God's promises to Abraham. But Paul shows grace here. Right? Gentiles are grafted in. But I want you to listen to the change of tone. Right? Because right now he's saying to the Gentiles, you've been given something that you didn't deserve. Now I want you to listen to this change of tone. Verse 18 says, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. Do not become proud, but fear. Right? The grace should produce a massive humility in you, not a feeling or thought of pride. And unfortunately, Gentiles throughout the church, they've looked at the Jewish people with disdain. They have looked and what you see have hated Jews for the rejection of Jesus, not realizing that they would have also rejected Jesus. They did reject Jesus, and they would have remained in rejection had it not been for grace. My parents, when they moved to Europe, I got the benefit of traveling around Europe, and because I love history, it was an awesome experience for me to travel abroad. And what I was shocked by was much of the anti-Semitic graffiti that was all over the place. And this lingering ill will towards Jewish people. Now, the European church has had a long history of hating Jewish people. And I'm not talking about Germany, I'm talking about all of Europe, I'm talking about Russia. There's a long history there for blaming Jews for killing the Messiah. Even men that we like, Martin Luther. Martin Luther is an amazing theologian. So when I teach students on history or government or church history, I love to tell the worst things about our idols of the past, right? Because what it does is it breaks an idolatry that we tend to have towards our heroes. Now, Martin Luther, I love Martin Luther, but he really struggled with having this disdain towards Jewish people. Not so much in his early years, but as he tried to minister to Jewish people and they kept rejecting him, he became bitter to the point where he encouraged Christians to burn Jewish homes and synagogues and to take Jewish wealth as much as possible. And this tradition continued. It's called a pogrom, right? It's a Russian word that means just to take as much as you want from these Jewish people. It was these riots targeted at this group of people. Listen to this quote by Martin Luther. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable devilish burden, the Jews. Right? He had forgotten about Romans 11, not to become proud, but to fear. This applies broadly, not just in the scope of being anti-Semitic, but broadly as we approach people who are different than ourselves. So upon realizing monergistic salvation, all pride should be dispelled. Right? Once you realize that God alone saves, there is no part of man, it's all God. He's the only, there's no synergism involved. God alone saves. There should be no pride in any of us. Listen, as a fellow Gentile, I can say this about ourselves. There's nothing good inherently about us. There's nothing good inherently about us. There's nothing that makes us superior to anyone else. And so Paul warns of some of this superior religious self-righteousness that might cause you to look upon others with disdain. Think about it. Who are we? We're no different than unbelieving Israel. We're no different than unbelievers. The only thing that separates us is that God has opened our eyes and opened our ears. And from our mouths ought to come a message of reconciliation and words that show humility and praise to a forgiving and gracious God. Romans 11:21-24 says, "For if God did not spare the natural branches," right, that's unbelieving Israel, "neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God," severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted back in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? So what we see, right, is this warning to the Gentiles. This warning that, listen, God has broken people off for unbelief, grafted you in. God is not unable to graft the Jewish people, these unbelievers, back in. So don't look down with them with disdain. It is by grace that you've been grafted in. So anyone who does not believe, Jew or non-Jew, there is no reason that we can boast. There's nothing better about ourselves. Listen, we are not necessary. We are not necessary in God's kingdom. We were having a deacons meeting and I loved it. There was one of our deacons, TK. I love it. And he does the editing to this video, so I'm giving him a shout. He said, as it pertains to the church, he said, it's crazy because as I'm watching God move and grow and people come to Christ, I realize I'm not necessary. And it wasn't like, woe is me, I wish I was. It wasn't like that. He said, I'm not necessary. Because he realized that God's going to move. And he's going to use TK's obedience, or he's not going to use somebody else. We are not necessary. God does not need the Gentiles. Truth is, we were all outcasts. Right? We were all outcasts. We once were all foreigners. And we knew nothing of this family. Yet we were invited in by grace. Adopted and grafted in. Receiving the benefits that God had promised to them. They had promised another people. So right, Paul is telling Israel, Gentiles, remember who you are. Remember your past. Remember your sin. Remember your unbelief. Remember your idolatry. Remember and do not be proud. You have no reason to boast in your inclusion into this family. Remember, you do not deserve the salvation that's been given to you as God continues to save ethnic Jews. Right? He's saying, do not be haughty. As God continues to save people who don't look like us, who aren't from the same background of us, maybe from a different economic background. We cannot look at them with indifference or disdain, realizing that they have also been included into this family. We should rejoice in that. We never should be proud because we've accomplished nothing on our own. Right? There's not one salvation or baptism that can be credited to the labor of any one man or any pastor. Right? As church, let's remember that we were all outcasts. Because we are a family, there should be no one who feels like an outcast to you. There should be no one that comes in and says, I just don't feel like I belong. I don't feel cared about. I don't feel loved on. I don't see Christ here. As Gentiles, our past is filthy and it is deeply troubling. Our family's past is offensive. Our personal past is no better. And if you believe that you're a sinner who is deserving of hell, and you place your hope in the life of Christ, His crucifixion and His resurrection, then you've been removed from this wild olive tree that was to be cast aside, and you've been grafted in. You are no longer an outcast. You are a child of God. What we see is that God will display His perfect grace as well as His perfect wrath. And note what Paul calls us to do. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you. Paul describes in this passage kindness and severity. So we have to ask, which one rests upon me? If you do not believe, let me ask you to repent of that. And trust in grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone, for His glory alone, realizing that you are dead and that it is through only Christ Jesus, His work on the cross and His resurrection, that you can have life eternal. For those who believe, who kindness rests upon you, may we respond in praise, in our heart and in our mind, in prayer.